Thanks for joining us today.
All right. Thank you very much, Tim, for the introduction. And I appreciate all you folks out there in the ether taking some of your lunchtime or whatever time it might be to join me on this conversation. I'm going to talk a little bit about actually kind of a thought exercise, what originally started as a thought exercise and developed into an article that came out in the Journal of Forestry a few months ago with my co-authors, Brandon Collins and Scott Stevens. And then towards the end of the talk, I'm actually going to show you some thoughts or some ideas on possibly ways of trying to move forward, trying to look at increasing the use of wildland, managed wildland fire, and prescribed fire as a broader-based tool for reducing fuels in western forests. And that section in particular, I'm hoping that I might get some feedback from folks out there on ideas about ways to move this forward. And to kind of generate some of that discussion, I'll show you some very, very preliminary GIS analysis of trying to look at potential areas that might serve as places where we might be able to make managed wildfire or prescribed fire a significant component of the tool for treating forests. But the first half, let me start by recapping a little bit of this article that we published recently in Journal of Forestry to kind of give some context as to where I'm coming from. What I want to do to set the stage is iterate first how this idea came about. And part of this is that, as many of you know, in California, we're on some of the front lines for implementing new forest plans. The Forest Service last year adopted a new planning rule. Finally, about 30 years, after about 30 years of frustration, has finally come out with a new rule that they have implemented. And that means basically that all 155 of the national forests will be starting this process of developing their next 10-year or so odd plans, which really guide basically a lot of the day-to-day operations of how the national forests go about their business, and often set kind of the standards and guides for some of what actually happens on the forests. And to me, this struck as a real opportunity. Maybe I'm just being unreasonably optimistic, but it's always interesting in these kind of watershed moments to see if taking a step back and rethinking some of the ways that we're currently doing business have merit, and ways of possibly interjecting a new approach, or at least approach to think about things a little bit differently. So with that, I'm going to go to the second slide here and talk about what motivated this paper in the first place, which was both Brandon and Scott had invited me to give a talk about fire and its use in California. And certainly one of the kind of standard axioms you hear is that although we know after many, many years of ecological research and general research on western forests that fire is a significant and important, some would even say keystone process in some of these forests, that in terms of being able to restore forests and reduce fuel loads, it's never going to be practical on a large scale. And this slide just tries to quickly outline some of the, although there's many more, kind of restrictions that make widespread use of either managed wildfire or prescribed fire very difficult. Liability, declining budgets, difficulties with rural home development, and particularly in California, we have air quality restrictions, mostly air quality districts trying to meet levels that are established by the EPA. So you've got kind of an interaction of local agencies and federal goals for air quality. But combined, it makes it very difficult to be able to put fire on the ground because there are not that many days in which the windows are sufficient to be able to allow the smoke particulate into the air. I'm not suggesting this is all of the difficulties. There are many more, but certainly these are some of the ones that come to mind. And I think that certainly in conversations about managing forests in the West, you'll frequently hear the idea that we know that fire is what the system needs a lot of times, but to be realistic, mostly what we're going to have to do is mechanically thin a lot of the forests to be able to reduce the fuel loads, simply because of these restrictions and the difficulties in putting fire back into the system. So what I want to do here is go through kind of the thought of, well, how much are we kind of out of whack with how much of the forest used to burn historically? And so I'm going to start out with just kind of some ballpark numbers on the historic levels of fuels reduction that we're currently undergoing compared to what might have been being reduced historically by an active fire regime. And the thought there is not to say we're going to go back to a pre-European type of condition, but more simply to just use it as a general benchmark for how are we doing. Are we close? Where exactly, what type of forests are particularly seem to be most departed from their historical norm in terms of fire? And then I'm going to look at basically kind of the decline of ecological and economic benefits that continue to kind of accrue as fuels reduction efforts are postponed. To me, both of these prongs eventually lead to a deduction that, frankly, the large-scale use of fire, particularly prescribed burning and managed wildfire, may be really the only means of effectively restoring and maintaining most of California's forests. And I would contend not just California, but much of the West that had a frequent low-intensity fire regime. And to get to that stance, I'm going to depend on this, some of the concepts in this paper that was put out several years ago about trying to look at intractable restoration issues and use something that they proposed called stretch goals and backcasting to try to figure out how to get around a problem or at least be able to deal with a problem that currently seems intractable. And then I'm going to talk about some of the constraints on increasing fire use and how we might overcome them. And again, part of the reason for doing this is simply that with this new round of forest plans, this is an opportunity to at least have this dialogue and to think about some of these things and whether some of them can be changed with changes in agency culture or incentives or whatever it might be, but at least to discuss these constraints. And then finally, I'm going to focus on this section that I just briefly alluded to of where might we go with this information, how might we be able to use this to look at identifying places that would be candidates for prescribed fire or managed wildfire. And in particular, I'm hoping that I might be able to draw on some of the expertise out there to try to get some thoughts about ways of refining this analysis and this approach. So if I put you to sleep in the beginning part of the talk, please wake up towards the end so I can get some of your insights about how we might move this discussion forward. So let me start with two kind of caveats to begin this analysis and this paper that I'm going to discuss. Is that first, I wanted to really reiterate that I'm focusing on forests outside of the WUI or the wildland-urban interface. And the reason is that I think all of us would agree that in areas that are backed up to homes or places that are particular safety risks, the first and paramount priority has to be on suppression and containment of fire. And so the discussion that I'm going to go into after this slide is going to focus much more on the areas that are away from the WUI, that are outside of it, because I do think the WUI tends to have a single purpose, or at least a highly prioritized purpose, which is really to contain and suppress fire. The other thing I want to mention right up front is that by looking at this question of the benefits of fire, I'm by no means suggesting that all fire is a benefit ecologically or for the forest in general, and a lot of that has to do with much research that's looked at historic fire regimes and their relative intensity levels. And certainly what I'm going to focus on in this talk is low to moderate severity fire. Much of the system in the West that periodically through fire suppression has gotten really converted from a low to moderate severity fire regime to one that much more frequently now is high intensity or high severity. It does raise a question about patch size of these burnings and so forth that I'm not really going to be able to go into today. But I do want to reiterate that not all fire is beneficial. What I'm really focusing on here is trying to restore or expand the use of low and moderate severity fire. And at the bottom of this slide, I've just put a quote in from Elizabeth Reinhardt's paper, which I think is really excellent summary on trying to recast the thinking about fire and its use. And one of her comments is that fuels treatment should focus on creating conditions in which fire can occur without devastating consequences. And it kind of flips this whole idea around that fuels treatments are first and foremost about suppression and containment, because I do think that a good portion of the landscape, fire can have really beneficial effects on forests. And so to rethink or recast that idea that fuels treatment's primary purpose needs to be on containment and suppression. And that's something I really think we need to revisit in some of these areas that are at least not right next to the WUI. So the first part in this thought exercise, and I'd be the first to say that there's some reservations with this, was to basically try to calculate for the Sierra Nevadas how much of it might burned each year historically before changes in fire regimes. And as you know, there's several things that went into the changes in fire regimes. It was not only fire suppression, but looks like changes in grazing patterns and climate patterns and so forth. But the point with doing this exercise is to try to take a look at how much of the forest might have burned historically, because over eons, that's probably the kind of frequency of fuels reduction that these forests are somewhat adapted to. And so it gives a benchmark for saying how much fuels reduction would have occurred, let's say, pre-1850. And in the subsequent slide, I'm going to look at how much we're actually getting done currently. But this gives some sense on here if you look at this table of basically the land types, the forest types in the Sierra Nevadas and the ownership. And this, by the way, this context is constrained from the Jepson, or is constrained to the Jepson classification of the Sierra Nevadas, which is basically from about the Feather River or about the Plumas National Forest down to the bottom of the Sierras, just north of Tehachapi and what currently is the Sequoia National Forest, including the Inyo. So this table gives some sense of the acreage of each one of these forest types that are out there, how much is owned by the Forest Service and the Park Service, or I should say more effectively, I guess, managed. And then there are two columns in there looking at mean and high HFRI, which is historic fire return interval. One is the mean is what the literature coalesces much more around. So for instance, on mixed conifer, you're looking at a mean of about 12 years. But if you look at all the studies that are out there and you take the highest quartile of the studies and you look at the mean there, you end up with about a 25-year interval. So the point with looking at these two is to kind of give a general bounds, since as we know, fire return intervals and their fire regimes have historically bounced around quite a bit. It's not saying there's a single correct number, but to try to give kind of a lower and upper bounds to these estimates as to how much we used to burn each year. So if you go down and you look, and particularly the highlighting, the green and the blue, are to kind of point out the take-home message here, is that the estimate for at least Forest Service lands, again from the Plumas down through the Sequoia, is that you had approximately about 488,000 acres burning each year. Let's just call it 500,000. And again, these are English units, so it's acres, not hectares. And the Park Service looking at about 65,000 acres. There's a split in the table to kind of make a distinction between active management and passive management. Again, these are not hard boundaries, but if you look at the forest types, you'll see that the active management tends to be stuff, forest types that we will engage more in terms of fuels reduction, or at least in the park's case are more a little bit in the front country, and the bottom part of the table, the passive management, is much more in types that are often in wilderness or roadless areas in which frequently we're not engaged in mechanical thinning or much more aggressive fuels reduction. But you can see that of the Forest Service lands there, about the 488,000, about 450 of them or so for the Forest Service, again, are in these active management areas where there is a fair amount of activity focused on fuels reduction, whether it's mechanical or prescribed fire or whatever. So now the following slide, I've got some numbers here that are general, that are gleaned as best as possible from agency databases about effectively how much is being treated each year in 3 different categories: mechanical, prescribed fire, or wildfire, and also roughly, and I emphasize here roughly, the costs associated with each. So let me first look at the area and how they come out in terms of both the Forest Service and the Park Service and what they're achieving with each one. And notice that wildfire has been included here, not so much that it's, at least on Forest Service lands in particular, not so much that it's a managed type of fuels reduction, but it does effectively reduce fuels, although we don't generally have that much, particularly on Forest Service lands, don't generally have that much control over what it does. But the thought was to use kind of the highest accumulation of all these numbers to take a look at, if you include everything, how much is actually having some form of fuels reduction done on it each year. So if you look across in the top row, you'll see that the total for Forest Service lands is about 88,000 acres per year, of which 51,000 is wildfire, and about 28.5 is mechanical, and just over 8,000 is prescribed fire. And if you go down and look at the Park Service numbers underneath it, you'll see, again, totals in there coming up. The interesting thing about looking at both of these sets of numbers is that surprisingly the agencies are at about exactly the same place in terms of how many acres actually have some form of fuels reduction accomplished on them each year, and that's right about 18% for the Forest Service and about 17% for the national parks. And by the national parks here, I'm focusing on Yosemite and Sequoia. I should make that point. But the interesting thing is that, of course, the approach is radically different between how the 2 agencies go about getting to those numbers. Mechanical makes up the bulk of the acres treated on Forest Service land, and in national parks makes up a pittance. In fact, it's kind of surprising, even there's 132 acres out there, but there are areas that the parks will treat, particularly in, adjacent to roads or campgrounds. But the interesting part, I think, at least for me, is if you look at the final bullet in this slide about the percentage of high severity in wildfires, it circles back to the way the 2 agencies are using wildfire. And this was a really nice paper that Jay Miller recently did with several other folks, looking at basically the percent of high severity in wildfires on Forest Service and national park lands, trying to constrain the forest types and so forth to similarities between the forest types and the forest conditions, with the main difference being the ownership. In this case, I believe Jay was comparing Yosemite directly with lands just outside of Yosemite, particularly on the Stanislaus, and looking at what resulted from wildfires that occurred on both of those types of ownerships. And I think one of the big differences here is an agency that tries to work with wildfire, the national parks, lets wildfire burn under particular types of conditions, is generally hitting a percentage of high severity that we believe is fairly close to what many of these forests used to have historically, which is roughly about 15%. Depending on the studies you look at, that might be a little bit high, but it's pretty close to generally what a lot of the reconstruction work and a few of the places in landscape that we currently have that have active or restored fire regimes in them. And that's compared to the 33% high severity, which occurs on national forest lands. And I think that, one of the things to certainly consider is that if you're trying to suppress or contain wildfire, once fire really expands beyond your containment efforts, it's generally going to do so under extreme weather conditions into places with high fuel loads. And at that point, you don't have that much control anymore over what severity levels you're going to get. And certainly, because of the kind of selective process you've put on it, where the fire only escapes under particularly challenging conditions, it's not surprising that the high severity levels are much higher on Forest Service land than they are on national park lands. So to my mind, it raises a question. There are many differences between where these lands are located, and certainly what the priorities of each one of the agencies are. But it raises the question of, could we achieve more of the fuels reduction that we'd like to see out there by trying to have a more flexible response to wildfire, and be able to think about times in which we might let fire burn, or at least what locations on the landscape might be favorable to reintroducing fire on a large scale, either through prescribed burning or through managed wildfire. A couple of the, I think, things that come out from even thinking about this is certainly some of the ecological and economic benefits that might accrue with fire. And actually, I'm going to back up here for just a second because I forgot to talk about the cost numbers here on this earlier slide. And again, let me reiterate that it's difficult to actually make apples-to-apples comparisons on these things. Each one of the agencies accounts for the cost a little bit differently. And even the designation on kind of what's included in a wildfire cost and what's not will vary between national, well, I'm not so sure between national forests, but I know they vary between each one of the national parks. The thing about the numbers here, and here I'm looking at the cost column, which is under the mechanical, the prescribed fire, and the wildfire, is that when you delve into the literature, these numbers are actually pretty consistent with a lot of published reviews out there about the general costs of these three different types of treatments. And if you look at the lowest cost by far, a way of treating each acre is prescribed fire with a ballpark figure of $142 per acre to $202 on national parks. And then you look at mechanical, which generally ups the equation quite a bit. There's not sufficient data to look at in the national park, but in the Forest Service, the estimate of about $554 per acre. I'm sure some people out there listening to this are going to go, that's crazy. You know, there are places that cost more like $2,000 an acre to treat, and I would completely agree. It varies very much place to place, but this is kind of the gross collection of values I've been able to get from the regional office, Region 5. So again, there's a lot of latitude in there. But the trend is pretty consistent between the relative difference of the costs. Is that prescribed fire is almost always, in all the studies published, the least expensive way to treat an acre, as mechanical can at least double or triple that cost, and wildfire, of course, can be anywhere from only double that cost to several, even a couple orders of magnitude higher, depending on the fire. And certainly in California, we've had experience with the Angora fire and some other places where the cost per acre were astronomical, depending on proximity of homes and the kind of concentration and public intensity and media attention that's gone into some of these burns. So the main point I want to make here is not so much that the values per se are cast in stone, but their relative differences are actually quite consistent amongst all the research papers I was able to dig up on the costs of mechanical versus prescribed fire versus wildfire. And that's really kind of reiterating the first point that I've got up there. The second one that I think anyone who's worked in this business for a while is very aware of is that if there's going to be any economical return often in these fuels treatments, at least in terms of the mechanical part, it's going to be in the first entry, because that's often a case where, particularly in productive forests, you've gotten trees which would not have been there under an active fire regime, but have actually gotten large enough so they have some commercial value to them. And in many cases, there's kind of a trade-off between removing some saw logs that might pay for the operation to occur and trying to cover the cost of removing the small material, which is often the bulk of the flammability or the fuels problem, but is very expensive usually to go into because it's just a net loss cost. And at least in California that I'm familiar with, a lot of this has happened or is handled with two different levels in which you have a commercial contract come in and remove the product that you might get some money for, and then you have a service contract that comes in and removes the small material. And that service contract can be very expensive. I've heard people say anywhere from $1,000 to $2,000 an acre, depending on all sorts of conditions. But the main point that I want to talk about here is that some of these fuels treatments currently will pay for themselves or almost pay for themselves because of those saw logs that are being removed. And we could debate about the relative merits of that or not, but the overall take-home is that when you go in a second or a third time in the future, when you're trying to maintain the fuel's reduced state, you're not going to have that potential economic offset. Those large trees are largely going to be gone, or there will be fewer of them that you'll have an opportunity to remove. And so the future of being able to have economic fuels treatments pay for themselves is certainly much more of a question mark, I think, as you go through, and particularly as you get into the maintenance side of this whole equation. And so the second thought exercise with this was to take a look at trying to calculate what might be called the backlog, which is, and let me give an example here, is let's say we're talking about mixed conifer forests and they burn every 15 years historically. So you have 100 acres to treat, and you treat 1 acre the first year, and the second year you move and you treat a second acre. Well, by the time you get to 15 years, year 15, in the 16th year, you can either go back and treat the first acre, or you can go off and treat a new acre, but it means that first acre has now had more fuels on it than it would have had possibly historically. And so what we did is we used the condition class index, in which condition class 2s and 3s are relative ratings for fuel accumulations, and the condition class 2 depends on this idea that you've missed 2 fire return events within the particular forest. So what we did on this next slide is basically take a look at, for each one of these forest types that are out there, how many acres you could possibly treat before you've either got to go back and treat the very first acre you treated again, or if you're going off to treat a new acre, that first acre that you treated is basically no longer in a reduced fuel state. So for that mixed conifer example I was giving, at year 31, you can either go back and treat the first acre, or you're going off and treating a new place, but that acre that was treated back in 30 years ago is now in a condition where it's fuel loaded again, and it does not have a fuels reduced state. And if you go through some of the hand-waving calculations about assuming that treatments relatively follow current rates and have relative proportions, at least in terms of wildfire and so forth, on burning on the landscape as the percentage of forest types that are out there, you can do this general calculation that suggests on how much of the forest you would never actually get to, how much of it ends up in what I have termed here a permanent backlog state, which again is that dividing line at year 31 where you go back and you start over again, or you go off to someplace new, but then that acre's not fuels treated anymore. And so if you look at the right-hand bar on this graph, you'll see the backlog roughly calculating that you've got about 2.9 million acres again on these national forests in California that basically will never be gotten to. And I think that's an extremely conservative estimate because it assumes that prescribed fire, mechanical treatment, and wildfire never overlap. They're never doubling up their efforts. They're always maximizing the amount of acreage that's treated, and of course we know that often prescribed fire is often applied particularly in mechanical treatment units the following year or a couple years down the road. So even with a very conservative estimate like that, you still end up with about 60% of at least Forest Service lands that you'll never get to at present rates. And I guess for me this is kind of a sobering, albeit arm-waving calculation, but really suggesting that unless we can fundamentally change business the way we're currently doing business, probably about 2/3 of the forest out there is always going to remain in some kind of fuel-loaded state. And you'll see that if you look at the forest types here, that particularly the pine-dominated and mixed conifer types are the ones that are going to be have the highest fuel loading or percentage of that backlog category. No real surprise there. This slide where I talk about some of the ecological costs of current treatment patterns, there are lots of examples that could be presented, so I'm really just focused on two that kind of immediately pop out when you start thinking about this question. But the first one has earned me some criticism from Forest Service people, but I don't think it can generally be denied that it's not so much a function of the way we prefer to do business, but kind of the litigious environment in which a lot of fuels treatments and forest management occur, and that is that I think that when we identify an area with high ecological value, whether it's a riparian corridor or a spotted owl nest, a fisher rest site, or whatever, we tend to put it in a kind of condition in which it becomes much more difficult to treat fuels in that area. And so it ends up in a condition I would contend is prone to ecological degradation, because it's either highly fuels loaded or it becomes a place in which the risk of high severity fire when wildfire occurs is much, much higher than it would be in a place that's had some kind of fuels reduction. And so, I sometimes think of acres out there hoping that they won't get a special designation, because when you get a special designation in the Forest Service, it definitely puts that particular patch of land at much higher risk to either being really fuels loaded or suffering the effects of high severity fire in a system that often did not have high severity fire or limited in terms of its scale and occurrence on the landscape. The other thing, which was an interesting paper that Sharon Hood had come out with a few years ago, was looking at this question that I'm sure many, if not all of you, have seen, where that you end up accumulating thicker and thicker duff layers and fuel layers on the surface. And at some point, you end up actually with fuels accumulations that are high enough that even under moderate fire severity conditions and let's say low flame lengths and so forth, you can still end up killing some of the very trees and the structures that you really want to maintain out there. And the bottom right picture gives just one example I've seen. There's many throughout the forest that you go into in which you have these really thick duff layers that have built up around the base of old growth trees, often the very trees that you're trying to maintain in the system, and that now are at much higher risk because of these accumulations of duff and litter layer that then make it much more difficult to put fire back into these systems. Even a low intensity prescribed fire or a managed wildfire under pretty moderate weather conditions, you still can well end up with significant mortality in these larger trees simply because of the residence time of the fire around the base of the tree, eventually cooking the cambium. And to me, this argues that the longer we delay dealing with this condition, the more difficult it becomes to actually put fire back into some of these places and really hold on to the particular ecological attributes like the large trees that we really want to maintain. So at this point, you can either turn yourself over to drinking and the pleasures of the dissolute life, or try to think of some way of maybe possibly coming up with a way of getting out of this box that we've gotten ourselves into, because if you can believe these hand-waving numbers, currently we're only treating somewhere on the order of about 15 to 18, 20% of the landscape, relegating about 2/3 of it in a condition in which we'll never get to it. And furthermore, the longer that we seem to delay in dealing with it, I think the more we compound problems in terms of fuel loading that makes it even more difficult to restore the system, or at least get ecologically beneficial fire back into it. But rather than drinking, I thought I'd take a look at the literature. I guess that's why I'm not on Skid Row, and I can get paid to do research in my office. But in this case, I mean, the only other choice I can think of is to try to look at what people have proposed out there for ways out of these really intractable problems. And a few years ago, this article came out in Restoration Ecology that's cited at the top of this slide, that presents these two kind of ideas about stretch goals and backcasting. And so to frame this issue in the context of this prescribed managed wildfire issue that I'm interested in, I've highlighted the kind of definitions of each and how they might apply. So a stretch goal is a goal that can't be achieved by incremental improvements that requires a significant change in methods. And some of this language developed out of different fields and so forth, but the one that's often cited as an example of a stretch goal is President Kennedy's comment, I think in the early 60s, basically committing the United States to putting a man on the moon by the end of the decade, which they managed to achieve with about 5 months to spare. But a very, very ambitious goal in which he was trying to kind of think outside the box as to where you wanted to get to and to really promote a significant change in the methods and the current pace of getting there. And in terms of the fire issue, I think it really suggests prescribed burning and managed wildfire. I would suggest in the most effective and really in the long run the only practical large-scale fuels treatment efforts that might be able to get us to a condition in which more of the landscape is resilient and has more fire in it for the ecological and economic benefits that accrue. The second part of this idea is this backcasting concept, which is defining a desirable future and then working backwards to try to identify how you get there from present conditions. And to my mind, the thought exercise here is that, well, if we're talking about lands outside of the WUI, the concept is to see if we could identify areas where broader scale use of fire might be applicable or might be at least be able to be put on the ground in some kind of a program that uses some of the better elements of the national park system, as well as the ability to put prescribed fire out there on a large scale. And certainly the only way that I can think of getting ahead of this curve of the backlog, the continual need for maintenance, is to try to identify places on the landscape where you could move them to a fuels-reduced condition and then take them out of the suppression land base. And what I mean by that is that you might have to concentrate your efforts of prescribed fire or mechanical treatments, whatever combination it might be, to get a particular area in a fuels-reduced state. But once it's there, that you would take that part of the designated landscape and continue to treat it in the future, either with managed wildfire or prescribed fire. And it builds upon a concept exercise that was done about a decade or so ago in California, I think led by Bernie Barrow and others, to try to identify areas within California national forests that they looked at as a coherent unit for being able to treat with or deal with fire problems. And this is where this concept of the fire shed comes from. Their definition, you can see on the upper right, is drawn from a couple of papers that came out looking at this concept. But the idea, builds on the watershed idea, but tries to use a lot of local knowledge as well as the knowledge about how fire moves through a landscape to identify areas where if you get an ignition, it's likely that the fire is going to spread throughout that defined area, the fire shed, and has a certain perimeter around it where the fire either needs to be suppressed because it's going to go up towards homes, or has somewhat of a natural boundary, such as the tops of ridges. And they took a look at this as an exercise that you could go through each one of the national forests and identify these areas. And from that, think of them and plan them and treat them accordingly as if they're a contiguous unit in which, in terms of your fire approach to them, the planning and the thought about fire occurs for the whole unit. And that's how the designation occurs in the first place, similar to a watershed concept, but in this case driven by fire. I'm going to suggest that there's several benefits to this, but two in particular that I pull out and emphasize here is that for ecological restoration, there's a number of studies suggesting that within 2 to low to moderate severity burns, you can achieve a lot of the ecological benefit that you're trying to get to within 2 applications of fire, if it's the kind of fire that you're trying to get into the landscape. The second one is that looking at designating the forest within this fireshed area allows you to think about scaling up treatments to the point in which you might be able to have an economic stability question, in which you'd have the ability to entice biomass treatment plants to maybe locate, or at least to work in an area for a while, because you're committing to actually treating a good section of forests at one time, with a little bit more certainties about being able to supply the biomass needs. The other thing that I think comes up in this is that if you're moving up to this type of scale, you might actually be able to economically couple areas. So, for instance, in this schematic, the riparian area, where you're probably not going to do mechanical treatments, or if you are, they're going to be very light, is going to be an economic sink. But on the upper slope positions where there's good ecological restoration and fire restoration needs for being able to thin them a little bit heavier, you might be able to couple the riparian area with the upper slope area so that the economics of one tend to support the other, so that we don't end up just kind of abandoning these areas of ecological importance that currently we often stay out of, such as riparian areas or packs, etc. So let me quickly go through some of the constraints on fire use, and then I really want to open this up more at the end to show you about some of the thinking of where we might move some of this information in the future. But the reason I don't want to dwell too much on this is I think given the folks that I know that who are on the call here, you're all pretty aware of these limitations already. But certainly one of the problems with wider use of fire has been the culture in the agency itself, that at least according to surveys, that there's not always the support level, the resources, or the lack of public positive perception about these issues to really support or move forward with more active burning. And I think that those in particular are things, maybe not so much the public part of it quickly, but at least the agency support and the resources, that are issues that we could revisit or think about with this new planning rule. The second one is the rural home density. And most of the studies that look at costs, particularly of wildfire and so forth, are very convincing that your options of using fire, as well as the costs that go in containing and dealing with it, start going through the roof as home density increases. No real surprise there, but it does mean that the longer you delay dealing with this issue, the more difficult it becomes as more homes become built in these areas, these remote areas. The map on the lower right, though, does suggest that there's some places, even in California with its 38 million people, in which there's still opportunities to designate fire sheds because of the relative low density of homes in some of these areas, particularly in the northern and southern Sierras. Air quality regulations, certainly in California, this is probably our biggest one. And I think this is what I'm interested in trying to see about revisiting the way that currently smoke emissions are treated. But I think one of the problems is that, at least with some of the regulatory agencies, there's not this perception yet that in fire-dependent forests, smoke production and fire is inevitable. And so rather than trying to look at some of it as an act of God, such as when you get a wildfire or lightning ignition, and penalizing other smoke emissions because they're planned or proactive, is really kind of inverting the priorities for what some of these air quality regulations should be set up for. And I'm just going to skip over the rest of this slide because I want to circle back to this at the end with getting some thoughts from some of the people who are online about ways we might deal with this. So this final section is where do we go from here? What might be the next steps for dealing with some of this? And again, I want to circle back. I think that part of what we're interested in here is at least having a conversation as these new forest plans are developed, of thinking about ways as to whether we can more widely use fire and whether we might be able to address some of the limitations, and particularly I'm going to mention the air quality limitations here in the next couple of slides. But as a thought exercise, what we first looked at was simply trying to find areas in the Sierra Nevadas in which mechanical type of treatments would be very difficult, if not kind of off limits. And I want to step back here and thank Ross Gerard, who's a GIS specialist with PSW with us in Davis, who has done a lot of the heavy lifting at running this initial analysis. But what I'm going to talk about here in the next minute or two is really just preliminary, and I'd like to hear what other people might think about ways of adding layers to this analysis or qualifications to it, and ways of thinking about this. But we wanted to first take a look at, simply if you were to map out in the Sierras, what is the concentration of areas, how much of the areas are basically in at least these three categories: wilderness, roadless, or on slopes greater than or equal to 35%, where mechanical is going to be very unlikely, if not off the table. I realize that with some of the more recent methods, slopes sometimes greater than 35% can be accessed, but I'm not going to go into the details of that. Generally, it's pretty expensive, and in some cases very limited as to whether you can do that. So we use those as criteria for identifying potential places in which fire seemed like the most likely tool anyway, because you were not going to be able to do mechanical treatments. We then pulled out areas that were private holdings, private property rights, whether it might be SPI or other ownerships. And we also pulled out areas with homes or within a quarter mile of homes, both the urban core and the defense zone. And then calculated the acreage by forest type for each national forest in the Sierra Nevadas for this. And I'm just going to kind of quickly show some numbers and maps here. But the interesting thing on this slide is that, or maybe it's already known to a lot of people, that there's a fair amount of acreage out there in each one of these national forests that basically is unlikely to be mechanically treated. And of course, some of them, particularly if you look at the bottom, the Inyo, makes perfect sense at 92% because it's mostly wilderness areas. But some of these other places, they wouldn't immediately pop to mind that there's a high percentage, such as the Sierra National Forest there, with over 2/3 of this land basically in roadless wilderness or on steeper slopes. So it does bring out this thing that saying that you're going to be able to mechanically treat or thin your way out of this problem, to me, seems increasingly dubious, and that there has to be at least some revisiting of how we might apply fire more widely on the landscape. The next few slides are just a series of each one of the national forests that we had, and they're kind of zoomed out, so it's difficult to see the distinctions closer up that you can in GIS. But they give you some sense of where you've got kind of concentrated areas, which is the dark blue color, for these areas in which mechanical is largely off the table. And certainly in Lassen and Plumas, you can see some concentrations there of areas that might work for this kind of fire shed idea where you might use managed wildfire or prescribed fire more widely. Central Sierras, here's a bit of a case in which the right hand of each side of these maps is dominated largely, I think, by wilderness areas, although probably folks on the phone would know more of the particulars. But still, there's obviously some places on here in which there's concentration of blue areas that are outside the roadless and wilderness areas. And here the Tahoe Basin, a lot of checkerboard ownership on the Tahoe, and then in the Lake Tahoe Basin itself, of course, a lot of wilderness area. And here the southern Sierras, Sequoia and Inyo. And then here on the Sierras, I was concentrating in a little bit, looking at the 67, 68%, which is basically probably off the table for mechanical. And in each one of these forests, we split it out by forest types, and certainly some of these things like the top most abundant category in the Sierra National Forest is subalpine conifer. Well, you're not likely to do much of treatments in those one way or another, but the blue circles of the mixed conifer, the ponderosa pine, Jeffrey pine, indicate that there's still pretty substantial acreage out there in these more active forest types, where it's unlikely that you're going to get mechanical treatments in them. And I think those are places to look at or start thinking about as possible designations for this fire shed concept, where they might be treated and then turned over to managed wildfire or prescribed fire in the future. So final kind of query slide out there is, what about the air quality restrictions question? And this is one that I've been starting to discuss with several people, including Brandon Collins and some smoke emission folks. And I think the thought is to try to change the way that, or at least reconsider the way at which fire smoke and emissions are looked at. And so what we're suggesting, and this is where I'd be interested in hearing some feedback, is trying to use the blue sky model, which looks at smoke production from fires. And in one of these fire shed areas, do a 50-year simulation in which you look at the smoke loading you would get, the number of days, the number of households affected in a likely wildfire event, and compare that to how much you would get similarly by proactively using prescribed or managed wildfire. And of course, what you're going to have is with wildfire, or at least an effort to current wildfire conditions, i.e. Escape suppression wildfire, you're going to have just a few days of smoke, but it's going to be very high smoke loads and often going particularly into the direction of where households are at. And my hunch would be that it's a proactively used fire system where you're either letting the fire burn or setting it yourself with prescribed fire under more moderate conditions, but particularly where you've got pretty good predictability on the smoke drift patterns, that the human health impacts are going to be much reduced in using an ounce of prevention rather than a pound of pain at the end when the wildfire does actually occur. And so this is a thought, is to try to model this out in a few different of these landscapes and take these numbers to some of these people and see if it might move the ball a bit on trying to be more proactive about this fire condition than simply sitting back and then saying that escaped wildfire is kind of an act of God in which the smoke emissions we had no influence on at all, when in fact we know that the forest is eventually going to burn, and we can either deal with the problem up front or pretend that we're not negligent when it happens at the end. So summary here, I've pretty much covered these points, but I just think that in fire-prone forests, the risks of active management are lower than the risks of inaction. I haven't touched on this directly, but to me this is just kind of a no-brainer in these systems that are fire-dependent. I also think that there's one of the things to revisit or think about with these new rounds of forest planning is that the current practices often kind of concentrate on holding on to current conditions, maintaining stasis, which to me seems fundamentally flawed in a world in which climate change is going to be continuing to move or change the stressors on these forests. Trying to hold on to current conditions is a recipe for disaster. And then I think frequently low intensity fire in the Sierra Nevadas is probably the most effective way to increase the resilience of these forests to a whole host of stressors, but particularly the type of stressors that might be coming down the pike at us with changing climate conditions. And then finally, I guess I'd say you can see the other bullet points up here, but that I really think that the new planning rule is an opportunity to at least think outside of the box, and even if these ideas are poo-pooed, to at least generate some discussion about if we're not going to solve this problem with more managed wildfire or prescribed fire, how are we going to get at this incredible backlog, this incredible degraded forest condition we have that's so prevalent throughout the western United States. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Malcolm. And I do have a hard time imagining you leading a dissolute life of drinking on Skid Row.
It's tempting some mornings.
Glad you stuck with the research. Okay, so folks on the webinar, we're switching over to this conclusion screen where the chat box is now in a different place, but it's expanded so we can see more of what people are typing in. And then we'll take your questions and we'll paste them over here. So keep them coming, and like Malcolm said, feel free to give him some feedback if you have any ideas on what he proposed in his presentation. So we did have one question from Stanley Petrowski early on in the webinar asking about what the Native American burning regime historically was, and I may be referring to the fire return interval there. Feel free to be more specific, Stanley, if that's not it, but go for it, Malcolm.
Okay, yeah, and let me know if I'm not answering your question or if you think I'm dodging it. I think that, you know, a lot of the ethnobotany studies and the historical anecdotes are pretty convincing that Native Americans had a significant impact on burning, particularly in areas in which there were concentrations of resources and interest in either opening up hunting areas or in particular crops that might be harvested. It's not clear how extensive that particular impact was broadly across the Sierras, and I don't think I'm quite qualified to go into all of that. It does seem there's a fair amount dissent in the research world as to how widespread it was or not. I think the end product is that regardless of whether it was Native American ignitions or lightning ignitions, the fire scar record that we use is the combination of those systems, however prevalent Native Americans may or may not have been, but that's the environment that the forests largely evolved with, and that it would behoove us to try to at least put fire maybe not into the system as frequently as historically, but keep in mind that a lot of the ecological processes have evolved with frequent fire as a strong influence on them. And in the past, that's something I've particularly been interested in, and particularly an experiment we were running at Tea Kettle looking at this. It was, like time and time again, we were trying to figure out what kind of made the particular system tick, whether it was soil respiration or invertebrate diversity or whatever it might be. And time and again, fire was probably one of the strongest influences on whether the particular process was stalled or still pretty active, diverse, and stable. So I find it a fascinating and interesting question. I think stepping back from it, though, from my perspective, ecologically, the important thing is to get fire back into the system, and at least I'm not qualified enough to kind of parse how much of it was Native American ignition versus how much of it lightning ignition.
Okay. Thanks, Malcolm. Thanks for the question, Stanley. Next question is from Jonathan Long. How's it going, Jonathan? I know you. And his question is, how hard would it be to refine cost per acre by converting those numbers into cost per ton of hazardous fuels removed or carbon in unstable pools removed?
It's a really interesting question. From what little I'm aware, and there's probably people on this phone call who are better aware of how these costs are calculated, but I think a lot of the cost estimates are based on basically how much person power and equipment you throw out there on a fire. And you probably could get decent ballpark estimates for how much smoke particulate you're putting in the air with a fire, or how much carbon is being emitted into the atmosphere. But I would think the fit between the cost and how much was emitted would be highly variable depending on a whole bunch of kind of factors out there, depending with any particular fire. I think it's an interesting suggestion, though. It certainly wouldn't be very hard to crunch these numbers in a spreadsheet and take a look and see whether there's trends. So, Jonathan, we'll have to discuss that some more. I think it's an interesting idea. I just have to think about some of the qualifications that might go on in it.
Okay. And then the next question is from Dave Passavoy, and I'll also point out that Dave included a link earlier in the chat box to how some of the backcasting was done in CAL FIRE's FRAP program. But Dave's question here is, can you please clarify what you mean by urban core and defense zones?
Good question. In this case, the urban core was, I would have to defer to Ross on this. It's a GIS layer we're able to bring up and find within the, I think he got this out of Forest Service resources. And so I'm waving my hands here a bit, but as I recall, it has to do something with the number of housing units per square mile or whatever that kind of triggers as to whether it's an urban core or not. So if you have one building within an entire watershed, that does not qualify as an urban core, but at some point you pass a threshold, and I don't know whether it's 3 houses per square mile or 6. It becomes an urban core. The defense zone is strictly done with numbers that are often cited in I believe it's kind of Forest Service standards and guides, and someone may correct me on this, but the first quarter mile adjacent to the urban core is designated the defense zone or the defensible fuel profile zone, and then the next 1.25 miles out from that defense zone is the threat zone. And there's controversy about whether the threat zone should be a suppression-focused area or not. So we did not include it in this analysis because of some of that controversy. But I think there would generally be consensus that the urban core and the defense zones would be areas where you'd want to have a different attitude towards fire.
And the second part of Dave's question here is, would these zones be where mechanical treatment is excluded? And if they were, how could fire be more acceptable?
Well, I would, maybe I'm reading this wrong, but to me, the defense zone is a place in which probably a lot of your fuels reduction is going to have to be mechanical. You might be able to put prescribed fire into these places after significantly reducing the fuels, but I've always considered the WUI areas, which is largely what we're talking about here with the defense zone and right next to the urban core, as places in which mechanical is probably going to be a priority, whether it's thinning or mastication or whatever. To my thought, how you might get fire to be more acceptable in these zones is that if you do a public outreach period in which you communicate to people that their best insurance for holding on to their home is not simply the mechanical treatment, but actually having prescribed fire really reduce the fuels in the area, that's your best insurance against having your home probably burned down, given all other things being equal. To me, I think you'd eventually get people coming around to the fact that prescribed fire in these WUI areas would actually be a huge benefit. I think that's kind of an educational and outreach type of question, but it does seem to me it's attainable with the proper methods and outreach for doing that.
Yeah, and I'll make an opportunistic plug for the 2 prescribed fire councils that are trying to work more on this education and outreach role in California. There's a prescribed fire council for Northern California, basically the northern half of the state, and also one for the portion of the Southern Sierra Nevada region. So if you're interested, you can email me and I'll get you involved in those groups. And actually, the Northern Council is having a meeting this Thursday and Friday at Hopland in Mendocino County.
I will be there.
Yeah, me too. Come see us in person. The next question is from Michael Valdez, and he's asking, how might this strategy be applied to post-fire context?
That's a great question. To me, post-fire is a real opportunity, since you've already had some levels of fuels reduction happen on the site, to really think about this question of taking that area and turning it over to prescribed or managed wildfire. I realize in a lot of cases what you've got in a post-fire context is maybe not an ideal situation. You may have very few live trees left. You may have a particular structure or fuels condition, which is not what you would have wanted to have in that particular location. But I frankly think it's a real opportunity to kind of revisit what is often our focus now, which is getting a forest back on the site and getting it to grow, and getting it to grow fast enough to get the base of the live crown out of a fire happening in the site again. And maybe a different way of thinking about these approaches is saying, well, rather than trying to get trees, first and foremost, big trees back on there, or if you have a timber focus, at least eventually producing saw logs as fast as you can, think about it as an opportunity to say, well, we've actually had a significant amount of fuels reduction done here. How might we let the forest grow in and just opportunistically treat or masticate certain areas so that we could keep a lot of this burn area in a place in which fire maintained in the future? I think that's a wonderful way of rethinking some of these our current approaches. And frankly, as I showed several slides ago, fire, particularly wildfire, is doing the bulk of the work out there right now for us in terms of fuels reduction. And so if we were to rethink some of these post-burn contexts as opportunities to keep fire in the landscape rather than trying to necessarily reforest it as quickly as possible, I think there's a lot of opportunity for taking a different approach that way.
All right, we've got another question, or I guess it's feedback here from Jonathan again. He says, in response to one of your ideas, Roger Ottmar with the Pacific Northwest Station has indicated that his shop could use the blue sky modeling framework to predict emission concentrations under both wildfire and prescribed fire scenarios for the Lake Tahoe Basin in particular.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that where some of the thinking that's coming from this is that it's going to take some probably political clout to be able to maybe have the EPA suggest that if we designated some of these fireshed areas, is that they'd be exempt or at least take a different approach to these smoke emissions. And to my thinking, the only way we might possibly get traction with that is dealing with this question of how many people are you going to dump smoke on going down one path versus how many people you're going to dump smoke on and have ill health effects going down another path. And so I'm glad to hear that Roger's looking at this or thinking about it already. It sounds like somebody I should get in contact with and find out how their approach has gotten traction or what they've done. But I do think that kind of gaming two different scenarios of the proactive versus reactive approach to this may be the only way of starting to move the ball a little bit towards thinking about smoke emissions differently than we're currently doing it, because I think the current system heavily penalizes proactive management because managed wildfire and prescribed fire is considered a human-caused emission that can get you dinged, as escape wildfire is not. I just think the incentives are backwards in that system. So anything we can do to try to change that conversation, I'm all ears for.
And Dave Passaway has another related sort of general question, I think, for the whole audience. And I hope somebody has an answer to this question. But does anyone have an idea to what kind of argument needs to be provided to decision makers to see a change happen? Or is it the public that needs to be convinced that there is a real problem? Do we need to talk about wildlife habitat, water supply, and quality? So any feedback from Malcolm or from anyone?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that some things clearly are in the public education realm, and some are clearly more in the political or administration realm. And to me, the smoke thing has to be somewhat of a political or administration thing, because even if you do your job perfectly well, you're still going to end up with, a few people who end up with smoke. And if you have those people call into the right places, they're going to create a controversy or a stink that's going to make it difficult unless you have the political will or the power to kind of stand up and say, we're sorry, we apologize, but we gave notice that we were going to light this fire, and this is one of the difficulties of living where the person lives and that you're surrounded by forests that are going to eventually burn. The flip side of that is some of these things do seem to me like public issues clearly in and of itself, and my main concern is that I don't know how prevalent it is, and I'm sure it varies, is this concept that full ecological restoration really requires fire. I think if we could get past the Smokey the Bear approach so that a lot of the public was a little more interested in the benefits, or at least aware of the benefits of fire, that is a huge but extremely beneficial public outreach campaign that's probably going to get a lot more buy-in to this more aggressive or at least more widespread use of fire.
Okay, and we've got a couple more people typing in questions and feedback right now. Someone put out a last call. I want to thank everyone for making it almost 15 minutes past the hour, so some good discussion going on. And Gus Smith writes here, in response to a previous response, my experience with air quality regulators is that they do not believe that the Clean Air Act allows them to trade off future large wildfire emissions with current low magnitude and duration prescribed fire emissions. So adding on to the complexities of the policy situation there.
Yeah, and I think Gus is absolutely correct here, is that, the current system is not set up very well for dealing with this trade-off, and I don't know exactly how to approach this, but I think we need to start having a conversation with EPA and with the political powers that be to at least, not try to revolutionize everything at once, but maybe find a couple places that we can designate as experimental fire sheds in which we look at this trade-off and we rejigger the way we approach the incentives and what the emissions are. Because I agree with Gus. I think currently, right now, it's very difficult to basically work with large-scale fire given the current interpretation of the Clean Air Act. So, yeah, I would just completely agree with Gus.
I hope we have some state legislatures on the webinar today. And we've got some more feedback here from Carol Rice. I'm just going to paste it over, but I'll read it first. The engineering department at Cal proposed that regulations revolve around population density, focusing on vulnerability with tighter regulations around freeways, cities, and thus looser regulations in wilderness. We could expand on that and support a new set of regulations. As with all new regulations, it would be based on a set of findings, communications to the public, and political maneuvering. We will need the findings of fact first and team up with those efforts by others.
I think that's a good point. I mean, one of the things I was kind of throwing out there with the GIS analysis is you could also build rings or layers in which, given either distance to urban core or highway or whatever it might be, you have different tolerances for smoke and fire. So you end up with a tiered landscape. I mean, frankly, the fire shed idea, I think may be one way to move forward, but eventually, off in the future, you'd frankly, I think, want to have much of the landscape zoned in which you had different approaches to a wildfire breaking out depending on what particular zone you're in. And several people have suggested this in papers that are out there. But I think Carol's got a really good point, is thinking about this not only in terms of the fire, but frankly, some of the regulations, the public perception, the approach. All of these things are things that, could be mapped and layered in the GIS, and then look for congruence as to where the layers line up once you overlay them that suggests that there's opportunities to use fire in certain locations. But I think she raises a great point that there's other considerations in these things as well.
Okay, so I'll put out a final call for any questions. I've seen a few people typing on and off, so you can fire them off then. And I'll start closing up by just saying I'll send out a link to an evaluation for this webinar. We actually do really love and work with feedback just on how we set these up, and we always like suggestions for future topics of webinars. And I'll also send out a link to registrations for those 2 webinars I mentioned earlier. You can see a little slide here in the bottom right for Dr. Connie Harrington's upcoming webinar. And with that, yeah, I'd just like to thank everyone for the question and answer. It's a really interesting interaction of science, management, and policy. It's like a big chess game with a lot on the line.
Yeah, that's for sure.
And yeah, and thanks to you, Malcolm.
Well, thank you very much to everybody out there listening to me and also getting your feedback over the last hour. It's I think there's a lot of great minds thinking on these issues, and only by everybody kind of collectively pushing are we going to get anywhere at changing any of this stuff. So we'll keep on chugging away.
Yeah, and feel free to stay on and continue the conversation in the chat box. Sorry if we didn't get to all the questions, but I think we'll bring the audio portion of the webinar to a close. So thanks, everyone. And I will also send out a recording of this webinar so you can share it with your colleagues and friends. All right, well, enjoy the afternoon. I hope it's sunny everywhere else, too.